It is the big one. We are, as businesses, as I said before, facing quite extreme challenges when it comes to cash flow management, and headcount is a big part of our cash flow consideration. What are the options that we have as employers right now for doing the best thing by our staff, but also ensuring we can keep the wheels on the cart with the business?
Yeah, well, there are a number of options that you have. I think probably about 4 or so. The first one, obviously, is to do nothing and to business as usual and just to pay the employees for working. And you'll find that there are a number of key employees, presumably in businesses and so forth, who will be kept on and who will just work away as normal, probably a lot harder than before the crisis hit.
Yeah.
But that's one option. The other option is to look at whether or not you can lay off or put your employees on short-term working. Now, layoff and short-term working is something which has to be contained in the contract. There must be something in the contract that says that the employer is entitled either to lay the employees off or to put them on short-term working. You can actually lay them off or put them on short-term working if it's a custom and practice in the particular sector, but that's a little bit more difficult. So if the contract provides, then you can adopt one of these measures. Now, just to explain that a little bit more, layoff is where an employer tells the employee to go home and not to do any work. And it must last at least 1 day to be a formal layoff. And short-time working is where the employee is asked to reduce their working week or their working hours and to reduce their pay as well. So if these provisions are in the contract, the employer can lay them off or put them on short-term working. Now, if that happens and they're laid off or on short-time working for 4 consecutive weeks, an employee can then serve notice on the employer saying that they want to be made redundant. Now, that's 4 consecutive weeks, or I should also say 6 weeks non-consecutive in a period of 13 weeks. And what the employee can do is they serve a notice giving the employer 7 days within which to make them redundant. And during that period, the employer can serve a counter notice which says, no, I'm not going to make you redundant. I'm confident that you will be back to work or back to full-time working within 4 weeks. And I can also confirm that when you do come back, there'll be at least 13 weeks work for you to do. And that's the only defence or counter that the employer has if the employee asks to be made redundant. Now, while on a layoff or short-time working, if no pay if the employee is not being paid, they're entitled to a minimum guarantee payment. Now, it's really not very much, albeit it's gone up by, would you believe, £2 since £2 a week since the 6th of April there. But an employee is entitled to a guaranteed minimum payment of £30 per day for 5 days over a 3-month period. So if they're on layoff or short-time working and not being paid for 3 months, the maximum that they're entitled to claim is £150, which is really not very much.
No.
So that's a layoff and short-time working. The other alternative would be simply to impose redundancy at this stage. Now, redundancy, as many of your subscribers will know, is defined as a situation where the need for employees or employees of a particular type ceases or diminishes. And clearly, the climate that we find ourselves in now, with the impact of the crisis on jobs and employment, that's a classic redundancy situation. There's less work, dramatically less work for employees to do, which means that an option for employers is to consider making them redundant. Now, if an employee has less than 2 years' service, they can generally be made redundant without any great ceremony, simply by giving them their contractual notice, which they may or may not be required to work, and telling them that they're being dismissed by reason of redundancy. They would be entitled to notice, and they would be entitled to accrued holiday pay, holiday that hasn't been taken. However, where employees have more than 2 years' service, employers have to go through a formal consultation process with the employees. And the purpose of that consultation is twofold. Firstly, it's to alert the employees to the fact that they're facing redundancy. And secondly, perhaps more importantly, it's to explore whether or not there is any suitable alternative employment that could be offered to employees to avoid redundancy. The consultation should be meaningful. It can't just be a sham or a kind of tick box exercise. But the main thing is to explore whether or not there is any alternative employment. And I normally recommend that an employer holds at least 2 consultation meetings with employees who have qualifying, the 2 years qualifying service. Now, these meetings, they may also, I should also add that where there are a number of employees involved, there may be questions of selection for redundancy, where an employer doesn't want to make all of its employees redundant, just a proportion of them, then there would have to be a selection process as well to decide who was at risk of redundancy.
Yeah, and those criteria are really important, aren't they, Martin, as well? You've got to be very careful that you're not discriminating, whether that's on age basis or a situational basis.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, ideally, the selection criteria should be objectively measured rather than subjective. So things like a disciplinary record, grievance record, qualifications, and that kind of thing are the types of things that you would normally select on. So that has to happen, and there's no required length of consultation, except where an employer is planning to dismiss a large number of employees, and if they're doing that, there then is a statutory consultation process which has to be followed. And the rules in relation to that are where an employer is intending to dismiss 20 or more employees within a period of 90 days or less, they have to embark upon a collective consultation process which must last at least 30 days. So it's a lengthy process, and if more than 100 employees are being dismissed in that time frame, the consultation has to take place over 45 days. So it's a long and lengthy process. And just to round that off, once an employee has been dismissed by reason of redundancy, if they have more than 2 years' service, they have the right of appeal against that decision. So it can be a fairly lengthy process to make employees redundant. And the fourth option is to place employees on the furlough leave scheme under the government's job retention scheme.
Yes, tell us about this, Martin, because there's been a lot said about this. There's a lot of commentary, but it seems to be constantly changing and being updated all the time. How does it work?
Well, first of all, I should say I think it's a very novel and a very good scheme, which is designed principally to retain employees and to do as much as possible to avoid redundancies and to minimise the risk of redundancies. It's a scheme that was introduced on the 20th of March by the Chancellor. And perhaps understandably, it's evolving as we go on. Initially, when it was announced, there was fairly scant detail as to how it would work and what the conditions were and so forth. But as the days have gone by, the government have been very good at issuing guidance bulletins, further elaborating upon the mechanisms and how the scheme will work. But broadly speaking, it's a scheme in terms of which any employer in the UK can place their employees on what is called furlough leave, which basically means sending them home without any work to do. And there are a number of conditions attaching to that, the most important one being the employee can't do any work for that employer. They go home. Now, the employer is then entitled to reclaim from the government 80% of the wage cost for those employees that are furloughed, subject to a cap of £2,500 per month. So it's a big help to employers, and I know from many of my clients that it has given them tremendous comfort in a financial sense going forward. Now, there are another couple of things about it. The scheme was introduced on the 20th of March, but it's backdated to the 1st of March and will run initially for a period of 3 months. So it's scheduled to end at the moment on the 31st of May. I think it's very likely it will be extended because to put such a tremendous assistance in place and then simply to cut it off, I think would have a very detrimental effect, and it would defeat the purpose of the scheme, because it would probably mean that there would then be large-scale redundancies. Employees can be furloughed for a period, they must be on furlough leave for a period of 3 weeks minimum, and can be taken off furlough and put back on. Interestingly, it's become apparent from fairly recent guidance that although employees can't work for their employer who has furloughed them, they can actually work for other employers during the period of furlough leave. And indeed, it's my understanding that they can take up new work with other employers after they've been furloughed by the main employer. The other thing is that employees are entitled to carry out voluntary work under the schemes being run by the government at the moment to help care workers and essential workers and so forth. They're allowed to do that. And
they're allowed to train as well, aren't they? There seemed to be some confusion about whether they could undertake anything that was sort of business-related training at some point, but we've had clarity now that they can actually undertake training under particular circumstances, can't they, Martin?
That's correct. They're allowed to train for the job of the role that they perform for the employer who has furloughed them, and that doesn't offend the rules of the scheme.
I think as long as they're not generating any revenue out of those training activities, I think that's the limitation, isn't it?
That's correct. That's absolutely correct. And the other thing that's come out of it as well is that there's a bit of a confusion about holidays during furlough leave, and it's now quite clear that holidays continue to accrue during the furlough leave period. And interestingly, even although the employer is only paying 80%, or if that is what they're paying, and recovering that amount, the holiday leave will accrue at the full rate of pay for the relevant employee. Yeah. And the other interesting thing in relation to holidays is that there's arrangements now in terms of which employees can carry over 4 weeks annual leave for the next 2 years to make up for any that they might have lost out on at the end of the financial year where there's no carryover provision.